Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the internationally acclaimed show from the Francisco Manuel dos Santos Foundation, It's Not That Simple. It's a special edition because we are here at the University of Lisbon in the main hall, the Aula Magna. And it's also special because we have with us Simon Sebag Montefiore, who of course is a renowned author, historian, TV personality. Simon is a best-selling author, prize-winning writer as well. Books such as Stalin, The Court of the Red Tsar, Jerusalem, the biography, Catherine the Great and Potemkin, the Romanovs, and many other books. I could reel them off, Simon, but
Don't bother. But can I just say thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thanks to the foundation for having me. And it is really great to be here in Lisbon. Very excited to be here. Thank you all for coming out, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
We are very much as well. Of course, you've recently released The World, A Family History, which is your most recent book, and we'll talk about that. But the first question has to be to ask you to give us a snapshot of what the world looks like today and why it's not that simple when you start describing it.
I think that's the million-dollar question, and I think to give a little overview, we're just coming out of what we thought was the way the world normally worked for the last 75 years, and in fact, historically, it was an extraordinary, exceptional period of order, and now today, the normal disorder of world affairs, of the world game, has been restored. And obviously it's an extremely alarming sight, an unsettling sight and feeling for all of us who were used to a world that we thought had rules and orders and policemen to oversee it, almost moral overseers. And one thing after another is being challenged. The paramountcy of the United States, for example, or the simplicity of a chess game between the United States and the Soviet Union that we were so used to for a long time. This has been placed by major players fencing with each other for power in a way we haven't really seen, not just in our lifetimes, but in modern times. And of course, much of what we regard as the normal world was in fact the world created after the massive global trauma of the two world wars and the years between. And out of those came the attempts to create global rules, global organizations, League of Nations, United Nations, and so on, and a sort of order where people believed that certain sorts of behavior were unthinkable. And there were wars, of course, but they were proxy wars in controlled places and with certain rules in place. All of that is gone, and we're now in a new order, and the new order is a multiplayer computer game where there are huge players that we're used to, like the United States and now China, Russia, which has the biggest number of nuclear weapons, and then a whole array of what I call continental powers. Some of them with pretensions to being empire states that try to emulate imperial pasts, like Iran, like Turkey. Some of these powers are very small, like the United Arab Emirates. Some are enormous, with enormous potential, which hasn't yet blossomed, like Indonesia, like Brazil, like Nigeria, for example. And others, again, are on the verge of being superpowers, like India. So the dangerous thing is that all of these powers now have their own foreign policies. They don't follow anymore a side. They're not on the Soviet side. They're not on the American side. They play both sides, and they talk to everybody. If you look at the conflicts that are going on in the world at the moment, not just Gaza, not just Ukraine, but if we look at other ones that are neglected because they're not so central to our worldview, South Sudan and Sudan itself, Ethiopia, Libya, Congo, which is quieter now. But these are places where millions, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, civilians have died without anyone really noticing in the West or doing much about it. But if you look at those conflicts and you look at the different factions, they're all supported by powers that we've never seen support foreign policy adventures before. You know, places like Qatar, Israel, Iran, Turkey, and so on. So this is the world we're in at the moment. And it's, just to finish, it's coupled with another sort of two dangerous themes. One is nuclear powers, which I'm sure we'll come to discuss in nuclear power. But we always presumed that we'd done pretty well about nuclear proliferation, with only, say, 9 or 10 or 8 or 9 real nuclear powers. But of course, that can change very quickly. And, you know, the time will come when someone will use a tactical nuclear weapon. You know, these weapons have been around now for a long time. And the other side of it is the great international organizations like the United Nations are losing not just the ability to make a difference and mediate, but they're also losing their neutral position. And we can see that with what's happening in Gaza, which I'm sure you'll want to discuss in a minute. And the same thing is happening in the arena of information. You know, we have to get used to a new era with these new technological advances in the internet, in AI.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we're facing a time when the reliability of old media, CNN, BBC, New York Times, are suddenly coming under very, very severe scrutiny and question of their ability not just to be neutral, but also to be reliable, which again makes the platforms much more important. So all of these things are going on at the same time, and I know we're going to discuss them in more detail. Don't worry, I'm ready.
No, and I'm sure you are, and you're the expert we want to talk to about all these topics. I mean, it's very clear that when you discuss so many different areas of what our planet looks like and the challenges that are there, that it's everything but simple what we're seeing, and we do this against the backdrop of constant evolving communication, media, and technology, right? Talking a little bit about what's happened leading up to this point and your book. What's different about your history, and tell us about your decision-making process to focus it on families.
Well, of course, you know, writing a world history was an insane idea and a very bad idea, and I was crazy to attempt it. But the great thing now is I've written it. I don't ever have to write it again.
How long did it take you from?
It took me 2.5 years to write, but it's really the result of a lifetime's reading, of traveling, working, talking to people. And, you know, the book is filled with conversations I've had with fascinating people, you know, from some of them who've played roles in the book, you know, from Margaret Thatcher to Shimon Peres to Kissinger, who just died a few days ago, and many others. And all of them I've put in the book in some way or other. But the basic idea is this. I think that world history is a tonic for troubled times. And we're in troubled times. And I think the only way to understand the wider picture of what's happening in places like Ukraine, Gaza, is to step back a little bit and gain some respite, some perspective, some sanctuary with knowledge from the whirlwind, the frenzy, the hysteria that we find ourselves in as we get our information from these extremely unbalanced sources of information, like the internet, like the you know, the X or Twitter or whatever. So world history is important. I wanted to tell it differently. I wanted to write a truly global history. Ever since I was a little boy, I wanted to write a world history, believe it or not. And what I wanted to do, I was a very nerdy child, as you can imagine. I was never into sports. All I wanted to do all I used to say to people say, do you want to kick a football around? I'd say, no, but ask me who was the third Soviet chief of staff, and I'll tell you. So I was a very odd child. But
that could be sexy as well in its own circles.
It could be, yeah, it could be. We hope so. We try. But I think that the idea of the book was this. You know, many world histories are written, and it's now become a sort of huge industry, world history. Every university has a professor of world history. But most world histories follow one strand through world history. And the human beings are slightly missing from the picture. It's a look at our species, it's a look at trade routes, it's a look at a certain part of the world. And the human beings are lost in the lists of commodities and trade routes and pandemics and scientific advances and empires rising and falling. On the other hand, I love biographies. But biographies are getting longer and longer and more detailed, as many of you know who read them. And in fact, I mean, to give you an idea, the new biography of Kissinger, which is coming out, since we're talking of Kissinger, is 1,000 pages long before he's even met Richard Nixon.
Wow.
So what I wanted to do was put these two things together. So I wrote to my publishers a proposal, and it just said, what I want to do is write a book with a world history with the span of the globe, all places, all times, but the intimacy, the juice, the grit of biography. And then about 6 months later, my publisher said, how's it going with the world history? And I said, I haven't got the faintest idea how to do this. And so my mother, who was then 92 years old, rang me up, and she said, Simon, give the money back. She said, give the money back. She said, it's just not worth the stress. So, and unfortunately, she died soon afterwards, and she never knew that I wrote it. But the point was, I realized that family was the ideal way to do this. Family ticked all the boxes. Family is the basic unit of human existence from beginning to end. It's the one thing that's remained constant, one of the few things. And it's an extraordinarily flexible, half biological, half contrived social creation. It always reflects the way morals work, the way religion works, the way society works. It can encompass, it can personify in itself empires, states, kingdoms, and after all, we all are not only familial, but familiar with family. It's as Samuel Johnson said, and I quote this in the book, you know, every kingdom is a family, but every family is a little kingdom. And that's true of all of us. So it's a universal, and it also did a lot of the things I wanted to do in the book. It's a very useful way to look at how states developed. It's a very useful way to look at the nature of races and nations, because they are very similar to families. And one of the themes of the book is that there are no pure races, there are no pure nations, there are no pure families. The book is a study of hybridity, of mixing. And then, I guess, another huge theme is migration. You know, we're living in an era of migration. Migration is going to be one of the biggest movements that are happening in the next 50 years. The world, huge numbers of people are going to move towards our countries. And, you know, and there's very little honesty about that now in politics on either side in every one of our countries. But the point is, armies are normally groups of men riding horses or motorbikes or tanks. But migrations are families in movement. That's what migrations are. And so, again, family is key. I could go on, but I would say that another theme that I think is important is one, female history. You know, one of the great things that we really value today, but which has been hugely neglected, is female history, the importance of women in history and children. And of course, family is a great way to do that. And the other thing is diversity. You know, diversity has been massively missing, even from really quite progressive new histories of the world. They still seem to sort of base everything when a Portuguese or an Englishman arrived in their ship, you know, and that seems to be the beginning of the history of so many places. But the great thing about using family is, I can tell the history of any part of the world, and I do. I follow dynasties as well. Many of the families I follow are royal, ruling families, power families, I call them. But, of course, those are going to include the Kennedys, the Roosevelts, the Braganzas, the Windsors and the Romanovs and the Habsburgs. But also, I resolved I was going to treat families in South Asia, in the Arab world, in China, in Africa, in Angola, in Congo, the Old Kingdom. I was going to treat all these families exactly as I would treat the Napoleon Bonaparte dynasty, for example. And so family is a brilliant way to diversify world history as well.
And let's be honest, I mean, I'll say many to be politically correct. It's really most, but many families are dysfunctional and the world is dysfunctional too, right? So
exactly.
Whatever way you look at it, the emotions that are there are really at the center of many of the decisions that are taken, and families are very much at the center of that. I wanted to explore the fact that these days, and you touched on it in your first kind of answer, but today I feel that opinions are more important than facts. And as soon as anything happens in the news, you have to pick a side. Whose side are you on? And then you normally follow the people, whether that's on X or whatever social media platform you're on. You follow people with a similar opinion, and you get further and further away from the facts and from the event itself. And of course, when the attack on Israel happened on October the 7th, very quickly after that, the spin started, right? The rhetoric started, and sooner or later, after we digested the horrible acts which were done in the Israeli territory, you started to see all over the world politicians, but commentators, journalists, influencers, whatever you want to call them, start picking a side. Now, obviously, you're very close to this topic because of your Jewish background. You wrote an article recently in The Atlantic where you directly tackled the topics that have been at the center of a lot of the controversies, such as genocide, such as colonialism. Tell us a little bit about that article, why you decided to write it like you did, and how you see the narrative around the attack and what's happened since around the world.
Well, I think that's the kind of hot question of the night, I guess. Sadly, yeah. Let's just say a word on history itself. I mean, it's never been more important how we write history and how we study history, and it's never been more important to try and master the sources, master the facts, without being guided, straitjacketed by ideologies. Mm-hmm. I mean, it used to be a struggle to write history against Marxist historians who viewed the whole of history in terms of class, for example, which was an incredibly distorting analysis. There have been other ideologies. There's been Catholic ideology. There's been imperial conservative ideology. And in our own era, we have a progressive ideology that many people call decolonization, which I'll come to in a second. But let me just take you, first of all, to why I've written about the Middle East. I mean, I wrote a book called Jerusalem, yep. the biography. And the reason why I wrote this book was because already then, when I wrote it in 2010, 2011, whenever I looked up histories of the Middle East, and specifically of Israel and Palestine and the Palestinians, those books would either be just completely Zionist or completely anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian. And as I began to read these books, I noticed that there was no meeting ground at all between the two. Each of them told completely different stories. So I wanted to write a history of the Middle East that really treated both. I read up about it, and I wanted to create a book that was perhaps one of the few books that was accessible to everybody, but had a mission. And I really started the mission in the 90s after the Oslo Accords, when I thought to myself, this is only going to work if both sides respect the narrative, the history, the justice of the other. There was a moment when that happened during the Oslo Accords. There was a moment. But already, soon afterwards, by the time I started to think about doing my Jerusalem book, as a sort of history of the Middle East through the lens of the Holy City, already when I spoke to professors on both sides, of course there were some wonderful professors, Palestinian professors, wonderful Israeli professors, who said a lot of the stuff our side says is rubbish. But for example, there was a moment during the year 2000 Camp David negotiations with Clinton, Arafat, Barak. And in the middle of those discussions, Arafat suddenly said, as the discussions were already beginning to fail, he suddenly said, of course, there was never a Jewish temple in Jerusalem. That's just a lie. And of course, everyone went sort of silent, because there was never going to be a peace agreement if the Palestinian, the PLO thought that they'd never really believed that there'd never been a Jewish temple, a Judean temple in Jerusalem. So from all these things came out that my mission to write Jerusalem and to tell both sides of the story. And that book exists, and it was attacked by all the right people. The settlers, Messianic Jewish settlers hated it, and so did Hamas sympathizers. But many Israelis, many Palestinians, and many people outside have read it. Millions of people have read it. Weirdly, it's been a massive bestseller in China, which is one of those strange things. Due to their Belt and Road initiative, the Communist Party recommended it as reading to the Communist Party.
Amazing.
But anyway, it's just one of those crazy details. So I was already, that was my kind of basis, and I really worked hard when I was writing it. For example, I interviewed members of every one of the Palestinian families that had ruled Jerusalem. I really made huge efforts not only I bent over backwards in order, because of my background, to make sure that I'd spoken to all the right people and shown both sides, and shown, Israeli crimes when they happened. There's lots to criticize in Israel, about Israel, and I make those, and about the Jewish settlement of the Holy Land, about the massacres in 1948 and what happened. All of it is in there. So that was my background for this, and that was my mission. And then October the 7th happened, and I immediately as I was watching it happening, I realized all sorts of things. I mean, I realized that the Netanyahu government had disgraced itself. This was at least partly a catastrophe caused by Netanyahu's idiotic policies with his present coalition that is in power today, which is the worst and most disgraceful Israeli government. But that did not in any way take away from the responsibility of Hamas for this appalling, barbaric crime when they attacked on October 7th, and the things they did deliberately. But even though they'd filmed them on their smartphones and GoPro cameras, immediately I saw really quite respectable people in the West, influencers, but really more than that, professors in Ivy League universities, war crimes NGO, the directors of war crimes NGOs that receive massive amounts of public money and also Jewish philanthropy, all of these people suddenly trying to deny what had happened and trying to save Hamas from itself almost, and actually debating whether people had been raped, people had been murdered, children had been killed, and so on. And then I realized that something very strange was happening. Now, I mean, the great thing about the internet is that it's made history incredibly kind of current and available to people that are interested in learning, which I include myself. That's the reason I'm on Twitter, is because there's so many fascinating, clever people on there you can follow. Yeah. But at the same time, the internet is a dumpster fire, a cesspit of conspiracy theories, of lies, of rubbish, of partisan bias. And so we have this weird thing where history has become ever more respected as an authority, especially, I think, since in many of our societies, even traditionally Catholic societies like Portugal, but especially in Anglican countries in Northern Europe and the United States, since the decline of the Anglican Church, people, and especially young people, have looked for a new moral polar star to follow. And much of that is anti-imperialism and a virtuous analysis of history, a righteous seeking of good people and bad people from history. And the guiding star of that new virtue, that historical virtue, has been race, because that has been the theme of our era, and the struggle, especially in the United States, against a deep racism in American history.
Yeah.
And we don't challenge that. That's for Americans to decide. But that analysis has affected and tainted the analysis of the Middle East, which is a complex mosaic of different races, different religions, that bears no resemblance to American history and the history of race in America. And so immediately I spotted that many people were saying, of course the Israelis, all those Israelis, deserve to be killed because they were colonizers. They were colonizers. And so I looked more into the decolonization theory, and I realized that no one had really pointed out, because decolonization theory had infiltrated our institutions without anyone really noticing, because everybody was extremely keen to fight American racism, and the Black Lives Matter movement, everyone supported, quite rightly so. But when it was applied to a completely different region, a different history, a different world, in a completely uninformed way, it's proved disastrous. And so I wrote an article in The Atlantic saying that decolonization theory is a sham. It's not based on history. It's based on a mixture of, I'm just going to finish in 1 second. It's based on a mixture of Marxist dialectic, Soviet anti-Semitic propaganda, medieval anti-Semitic tropes, and thrown into it a touch of US anti-racist theory. And all of this is mixed together to provide a very, very toxic, a very poisonous, an eliminationist ideology that proposes that 10 million Israelis should be slaughtered because they are something called colonizers, which bears no resemblance at all to the history.
when you look at the atrocities that continue to be committed in the region at the moment, and I wanted to get your insight on how long do you think this conflict will last and what it's going to take for Israel to stop bombing Gaza. So obviously we know that Netanyahu also has many political and legal challenges in his own territory. Can this be something that also incentivizes him to prolong this counterattack, this counteroffensive, this
I think
self-defense?
I think we have to start in order here.
Okay.
I mean, there was a ceasefire. I mean, we're not going to dwell on this all evening, but there was a ceasefire in Gaza. Hamas ruled Gaza. Hamas is a Islamicist terrorist sect that rules Gaza as a one-party state. Many Gazans, many Palestinians are not supporters of Hamas and bear no responsibility for Hamas. Just as many Israelis bear no responsibility for the settlers in the West Bank either. But let's just take this in order. There was a ceasefire. On the 7th of October, Hamas broke the ceasefire and launched a barbaric raid into Israel, which you can watch if you want to see what happened. Israel, like any other state on earth, reserved the right to defend itself, and also, rightly so, in my view, decided that Hamas could no longer be an organization that they had any relations with, and could no longer be, as many Western countries, most Western countries, by the way, decided that Hamas could no longer be treated as a sort of civilized player in diplomatic discourse of the world. And Israel decided to destroy Hamas or scatter Hamas and break Hamas as a political military force. And I think that is justified. Too many Palestinian civilians have been killed in the resulting war. And I personally grieve every one of them. Too many have been killed. And Hamas must bear a large part of responsibility for that, since they openly, and they've declared this in many interviews, have used the people of Gaza as not just a human shield, but a human sacrifice to the resistance. And but on the other hand, I think that Israel's bombing has killed too many innocent Palestinians. And
what do you think is going to take for there to be any kind of hope of a negotiation to have a longer ceasefire?
What I think has to happen is that they have to scatter Hamas, at least break Hamas as a political force. But what I really dream of is the two-state solution. Is that the moment this is over, and the moment the Israeli hostages are home, the moment that there is peace in Gaza, which I hope will be very soon, the moment this is done, I mean, my dream is a Palestinian state. It is overdue. It is unjust there isn't a Palestinian state. The negotiations towards the pathway to a Palestinian state must begin immediately, as soon as this is over. And by the way, that was already in train in some ways, because the reason why Hamas launched this war, this raid, and sparked this war was precisely to stop an Israeli-Saudi peace. Mm-hmm. And the Saudis, part of that peace would have been the Saudis reinvigorating, refinancing the Palestinian Authority, Hamas's chief rival. And Saudi, of course, is Iran's chief rival, and Iran is the backer of Hamas. So all of this made a sort of brutal, barbaric sense in politics. And yet, out of these terrible tragedies in the Middle East, sometimes, just sometimes, when the trauma of these events will never heal, the Israelis will never recover from October the 7th. The Palestinians of Gaza will never recover from this war either, from the bombing of Gaza. No one will forget this. These things will never heal. But out of the trauma, out of the sort of exhaustion of war, out of the weariness of bloodletting, out of this will come a sort of shock, a sort of feeling that we must talk. And this can't go on. And out of that must come a new leadership, first of all. There must be a new leadership in Israel. I mean, as soon as there's an election, Netanyahu will be out. And Netanyahu and his government of messianic crazies who've been, not only disgraceful, but incompetent as well as disgraceful. They must go. But also there's a real leadership problem in the Palestinian side as well. The leadership has been appalling so frequently. If you remember, I don't know how much of the history you all know, but there are many examples of the Palestinians turning down offers. But all of these offers were for part of Palestine. There were arguments that why should they accept half of Palestine or 25% of Palestine when once all of Palestine was theirs. But in 1939, the Mufti of Jerusalem, al-Husseini, turned down the whole of Palestine. He turned down the whole of Palestine offered by Neville Chamberlain, and because it had some Jews in it. So, that was in 1939. It was a long time ago now. What we need now is Muhammad Abbas, Abu Mazen, the president of the Palestinian Authority, is corrupt. It's a sclerotic, disrespected institution. Israel cannot do this on its own. The Arab states must help to, and will help, and are very keen to help. The moderate Arab states are very keen to help reinvigorate the Palestinian Authority. And then negotiations must start immediately. Soon, please.
Yeah. Incredible insight into this conflict, the history, and how it's affecting the current state of affairs there. We only have about 10 minutes left, and I definitely wanted to get your take on a couple of other key topics. I mean, obviously one of them is the conflict in Ukraine. You know this territory so well, former war correspondent in the former Soviet Union. You've written extensively about Russian history. A little bit of a similar question to you, Simon, from the former conflict we were discussing. How and when is this going to end? And does it depend on how long both sides get support from other nations who keep basically financing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think already it's a proxy war in the new world game, as you refer to it. But we're now in a military stalemate. I mean, it is possible that Ukraine could win a victory against Russia, even though Russia has much greater resources. And also, those of you who know Russian history or have read my books on Stalin or the Romanovs will know that Russian leadership has a much more negligent view of civilian casualties or military casualties than normal other nations do. And so, Putin is able to lose. I mean, no one knows exactly how many people he's lost, but it's hundreds of thousands. It's getting up towards, it's getting up to the late 100,000s now, and he has lost these. He's just thrown these people into the war. Many of them are from poor or ethnic backgrounds in Russian Federation, and yet Russia has solidified its performance, has improved its performance. And so, I think that it is possible that Ukraine could win a victory if we shower it with Western aid, with U.S. technology, which so far the West has been very careful and cautious to do, for fear of the nuclear threat that Putin has made, and we should move very cautiously. If there was a victory against Russian troops, a decisive military victory, if that happened, then I think that Putin's entire rule and the whole nature of Putinism, that strange ultranationalist, sort of imperial confection, would be in doubt. Because, of course, there's no reason ultimately why Russia shouldn't one day be a democracy like any other country. There's not. I mean, there's a tradition, but it's not an imperative.
But could Vladimir Putin get to a point where he fears defeat so much that he could deploy a technical nuclear weapon?
That's right. I mean, that is possible. It's also likely that before that happened, the people around him would remove him. And that is also very much a Russian tradition. Remember, for example, in 1964, Khrushchev was removed really because he'd humiliated the Soviet Union in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was his own personal initiative. And there are many other examples among the Tsars of Tsars being removed by the people around them. I mean, Nicholas II, in effect, was removed by his generals for that, partly for that reason. But if everything continues as it is continuing, there is going to be an exhaustion on both sides, and if that is the case, then they will negotiate. And I know it's regarded as bad manners to suggest any negotiation. But I'm not saying it in order not to be supportive to Ukraine, whom I very much do support as a democracy, as a country that wishes to be free, as a brave resistor of dictatorship and invasion. But at some point, there will be a negotiation. And out of these negotiations, if they take place after a military stalemate, will come new borders. Armistice borders, effectively. And those armistice borders may well one day become the borders of the accepted borders, just as they did with Israel and the Arab states in 1948-49, or just as they did with India and Pakistan after independence. And of course, each of those groups fought 4 wars subsequently. So I'm not saying this will be the end of the matter. If Putin was to use Crimea, his rule would be over and the autocracy would fall.
Final question before we move into the quick fire round that we always have for our guests, because I can't finish this conversation without asking you about the American elections of next year. There's less than 1 year to go. I lived in the States a long time. I understand the country very well. It worries me, and I think it worries the planet, what could happen there if Donald Trump were to gain back the White House. We don't have time to get into how ludicrous that idea seems to be after everything that happened at the end of his last mandate, but how concerned are you for the health of democracy if Donald Trump wins there, and do you think there's a definite possibility he could?
There's a real possibility that he could. I wouldn't like to put a percentage on it, but it's really possible. He's way ahead of all the Republican candidates. Nikki Haley would be a much better candidate for all sorts of reasons, but he's way ahead. I think that it would be disastrous for American democracy. I think he wants to be an American czar, an American dynasty, and I think that he's an extremely vindictive and dangerous character. We just have to pray that Joe Biden stays alive, because there's not much between us and Donald Trump as president, and actually Joe Biden's turned out. I mean, I was pretty unimpressed with Joe Biden, particularly after Kabul and other disasters. I think he's not doing too badly, but I think American democracy would be really in danger, in peril, in jeopardy if Trump wins. I like to think that so many people know too much about him now, and that there would be, despite everything, a winning coalition who would vote for Biden or whoever it is, a Democratic candidate, just to stop Trump. But American democracy is in jeopardy, and I look at Trump. I see a sort of mixture of Kaiser Wilhelm II and the Emperor Nero, neither of whom are a good precedent, are they?
No.
No. So on that depressing note, I'm deeply worried about America. But on the other hand, as I wrote in the book, even in the first edition of the book, America isn't going anywhere. America is still prospering. It's still the most dynamic nation on earth, and it still has the power to do good, I believe, in world affairs.
All right, we're going to wrap things up with our quick fire round. So one word or one short sentence to reply to each one of these final questions, please. What is a personality trait that a good leader could really benefit from having?
Vision and acumen.
What is the biggest challenge that humanity is facing at the moment?
Climate change, nuclear proliferation, and AI.
Those are three big ones. Out of those three, what's the biggest?
Nuclear proliferation is the most immediate danger because it can destroy the world in 1 second.
If you could change one thing about the world right now by some magical
Plastics. I would reverse the invention of plastics.
Wow. And what is the most important learning of your life and career?
Important learning.
Yeah. What's the most
important thing I learned was to listen to cleverer people.
The ability to listen is something that so many powerful people forget when they get there. It's unbelievable. Simon, we have to close. There's so much more that I would like to discuss with you, but time has run out. It's been an absolute pleasure to get your insight, your expertise into these incredibly complex but so crucial topics of our planet. The new book, The World, A Family History, is now out, and hopefully that can also help us understand where we come from and where we may be going, and how family is at the center of so many of those dynamics. Thank you so much for your presence here today.
Thank you.